In the 16th century, Europe was rocked by the Reformation, a period of unmatched religious strife and fervor in the Western world. Coming on the heels of the Renaissance, which was among other things a rediscovery of the classical past, the Reformation was an attempt to restore a more pure and primitive form of Christianity. However, as always, nothing is ever so cut and dry, and we can never discount the role of pure politics. In this lecture, I will start off by establishing the context of the Reformation with a focus on its Protestant manifestations. I will reserve a discussion of the Catholic Counter-Reformation for another time. Consequently, I will also refrain from discussing the humanist involvement in the religious politics of the era, as most of them were affiliated with the Catholic cause rather than with the Protestants. We will look at Martin Luther's teachings and the 16th century conflict in the Holy Roman Empire between Protestants and Christians. Next, we will look at the spread of Lutheranism to other parts of Europe, especially Scandinavia. Our other major focus will be on the Reformed Church of Zwingli and Calvin in Switzerland. We will touch on the Anabaptist, but not in great detail. We will wrap things up by discussing the Huguenots of France and the impact of Calvinism on the Dutch bid for independence in the latter half of the 16th century. My hope is that by the end of this lecture you will understand the broad outline of the Reformation, at least the Protestant side of it, and that you will be in good stead to move forward and understand how Europe transitioned from the Middle Ages to the early modern period. As I see it, there are effectively three forms of context that one needs to understand before one can properly appreciate the origins of the Reformation and also why it very well may have been inevitable. First up, we'll look at political context. As I've frequently said in the past, politics is something that always manages to worm its way into everything. Everything is, on some level, political, or at least politicized. Here we see that one of the real driving forces of the Reformation, and something that would explode into open conflict, was the struggle for power between secular lords on the one hand and the church on the other. This was very much a battle for money and power, particularly a battle over revenues, titles, and the ability to appoint or depose officials. If we start out by thinking of revenues, we have to remember that the Catholic Church owned considerable property in nearly every Catholic country at this time, and that the revenue that those properties produced went straight to Rome without really going into the coffers of secular rulers. Secular rulers, for their part, wanted a piece of the action. Popes claimed the ability to confirm or depose kings and emperors, and also to control the appointment of bishops in any Catholic country. The first part, popes claiming that they can confirm or depose kings and emperors, I don't think it will require much explanation as to why kings and emperors were not too keen on that particular idea. Kings and emperors wanted to owe their power to no one except themselves, and they also didn't want an overlord who might interfere with their succession wishes. So they more or less successfully did resist this idea that popes can make or unmake secular rulers. However, many popes were ambitious in terms of trying to make that a reality. In terms of the appointment of bishops, we have to remember why this is significant. It's not a purely religious matter. If you are the Pope, then you want to control who the bishops in each country are, so that way you have people who are loyal to you. And this means that if you excommunicate a ruler, the bishop will be likely to not side with that ruler, and perhaps even spark a revolt of some kind in order to put that ruler back in line. So this is a way to enforce control, and the more loyal the bishop, the more likely they are to resist any attempts or pressure to share revenue with secular rulers. On the other hand, if you are a king or emperor and you are able to appoint bishops, you're more likely to find people who are loyal to you and who would make life easier for you if you happen to have trouble with Rome. They also are more likely to share the wealth a little bit. So it is very much about power, this control of bishops. And of course, popes can also cite the fact that they are the religious authorities, and so they know who would do the job best. But ultimately, it comes down to money and power. When we look at the peasantry, we see that their concerns are a little bit different. By this point, Europe was prospering more than it had since probably Roman times, perhaps not as much as during the height of the Roman Empire, but still, parts of Europe were doing quite well. And because of that, all segments of European society were thriving, including the Catholic clergy. In the minds of many peasants, especially in Germany, a lot of prelates were living high on the hog, as it were. They were keeping mistresses, they were living in luxurious houses, they were doing things that didn't quite seem to mesh with taking a vow of poverty. And so the combination of these factors very much drove the political winds, especially in Northern Europe, against the Catholic Church. There also is a geographical factor to consider. When the revenues were taken out of the less prosperous parts of Northern Europe, they were sent to Rome, which was more prosperous and also more adorned with great buildings. Renaissance Italy had become quite prosperous. So there were many in Northern Europe who were resentful of the fact that they were being taxed to fund luxuries in places that they might never get to visit. The practices of the Church in the 16th century also occasioned a good deal of opposition, and this is the second kind of context that you need to keep in mind. The leading figures of the Church, as I alluded to above, were often worldly. They frequently lived in luxury and ignored their vows of chastity by keeping concubines or having mistresses. Pope Leo X, pictured here, was a member of the famous Medici family, and while he was far from the most corrupt pope of the era, he would do things that would favor his own family. And that is a pretty mild example of some of the kinds of corruption that had become pretty normal during his time. A number of the largest landlords in Europe were church-appointed officials, especially archbishops, and while you might think that they would be a little bit more lenient as landlords, that was not necessarily the case, and in fact, they had a reputation for being worse landlords than their secular counterparts. And of course, the lay lords of Europe were not exactly known for being kind and gentle to peasants, so that's saying quite a bit. A lot of the popes could also be rather grasping. Pope Julius II was one of those popes who was very much ambitious to extend the church's reach over secular lords. And he came into conflict with Emperor Maximilian I over the rights to revenue streams from the Holy Roman Empire. And tensions rose to the point that Maximilian, who of course as a Holy Roman Emperor already had his power diverge in a number of directions due to the sheer complexity of the Holy Roman Empire, and he was so distraught by the loss of revenue that at one point he and one of his advisors were trying to draft a resolution to break away from the Roman Catholic Church. Ultimately, he decided not to go ahead with that simply because he thought that the resistance from the common people would be too great and he would effectively start a social revolution. So he backed away. But the tension was very real. And interestingly enough, after Julius died, he was succeeded by Leo X, the Pope on the screen, and Leo X, unlike his two immediate predecessors, was aware of the extreme tension and actually was trying to relieve it to some extent by being a little bit more conciliatory to secular rulers like the Holy Roman Emperor. But ultimately, the pressure was still there, and by this point, people understood that popes don't live forever, so if there is a pope that you happen to like, his rule will be replaced by someone you might not like within probably 10 years or so. So Pope Leo, despite kind of understanding the problem and trying to address it, would ultimately really get hit with the problems that his predecessors had done so much to create. As I mentioned above, there was also a general perception, almost entirely true, that money was going to Italy to fund luxuries and that this wasn't fair to people who paid the different tithes to the church in, say, Northern Europe. travel wasn't all that frequent, so a lot of people would never get to see the things that they were funding, much less live in the places where these luxuries were readily available. One practice in particular stood out as being corrupt and as being objectionable both to many peasants who were aware of it and also to many theologians who found it to be troubling that the church was so materialistic. And that was the practice of indulgences. Indulgences were actually not a new practice in this period. This is something that the Catholic Church still has, by the way. But in this period, they had gotten out of control in the minds of most theologians at the time. And effectively what indulgences are actions taken to compensate for sin. And in this period, they were becoming increasingly financial in nature. So if you donated enough money to some project or to the poor, you could be forgiven of sins. And in 1517, Pope Leo, who was despondent because of the slow progress on the new St. Peter's Basilica, decided to raise money through indulgences to help finish the basilica. The old St. Peter's was effectively a wreck. The new one was not ready to go. It was massively behind schedule and over budget. So he thought that this would be a good way to get money for it in order to get the thing up finally. So he dispatched papal envoys in 1517 to raise money, and of course one of those envoys ran into a man named Martin Luther, but we'll circle back to that in due time. And finally, let us consider the cultural, or you might prefer to call it intellectual, context in which the Reformation emerged. First up, we have to remember that this is the age of the printing press. Gutenberg had developed the printing press in the 1450s, and by about 1500 or so, it had become fairly efficient and was able to put out a pretty decent amount of books. This allowed for a rapid dissemination of ideas across Europe, while also making books more affordable by increasing the supply. The supply of books increased faster than literacy rates, but literacy rates were also rising during this period. And literacy in particular was rising in vernacular languages, that is to say, local native languages rather than Latin. The educated elite of Europe still communicated in Latin, but there were many people of more humble means, say small-town merchants or what have you, who could read or write in their native language, whether it be German or English, without necessarily knowing Latin. And the printing press enabled the spread of text in all languages, not just in Latin. So this meant that a greater number of people could partake in debates and be aware of controversies than was the case before. One thing to keep in mind about the thinkers of this era is that they sort of gravitated to a type of rhetoric that we would think of as being rather coarse. The men who wrote most of the theological tracts in this period, both on the Protestant and Catholic side, tended to be rather vituperative and hostile. They were not at all reluctant to advocate for violence. And just to give you a sense of how difficult these men could be to deal with, it was pretty common for the great thinkers of this era to crow over the deaths of their rivals and proclaim any kind of unfortunate accident that would befall one of their rivals as God's vengeance. So this was not an era where there was a lot of merriment, at least in terms of the writing at the time. The closest thing, I guess, would be Luther, who could make a good jab in his writings at the expense of someone else, but for the most part, we are dealing with people who are mostly humorless. Late 15th century intellectuals, these are people who are working a generation before Martin Luther, actually managed to prefigure most of Luther's major complaints and his appeals to German and in some cases French national unity in the face of Roman Catholic power. One example is Dieter von Eisenberg, who was Archbishop of Mainz. He came to power in 1459, and effectively the Pope at the time demanded that he pay an enormous sum in order to confirm his position. Dieter refused and was deposed. He then came back with troops and lost a battle, and then he wrote to the secular leaders of the Holy Roman Empire and of France and basically told them if they don't act in concert with one another that they will continue to get pushed around by Rome. Eventually, most likely due to the death of Pius II, he eventually did retake his seat as archbishop and went on to die in 1481. But his ideas didn't spread that much. He was concerned with holding on to his seat, and apparently it never occurred to him to publish his ideas and his critiques of the Catholic Church and its practices. Had he done so, then it's possible that the Protestant Reformation might have gotten started 40 years earlier, but he didn't. Perhaps part of the reason why Dieter didn't try to appeal to a broader audience with his concerns about the Catholic Church is because he didn't think he'd find a very receptive audience. Most Germans and most Europeans more broadly were quite satisfied with what the Catholic Church was offering up at this time. So far as most religious leaders were concerned, the peasants were perfectly happy with the way that Catholicism was operating at this time. Now, there were growing critiques against the church even this early, say in the 1480s, about the excessive wealth of the church, but for the most part, there was not a great deal of discontent until the 1510s or so. There were, however, exceptions, and in fact, there was an entire movement that has often been characterized as proto-Protestant. There were groups which were forming and which rejected all or significant parts of the teachings and practices of the Catholic Church. To give you a few examples of some of these individuals and groups, there were two brothers in the city of Eger in the year 1466 who declared openly that indulgences, at least in terms of financial indulgences, were a hoax. They said that there's no way that someone can simply pay money and buy their way out of committing sin. As you might imagine, the Catholic Church took exception to such ideas. There was also a group called the Waldensians, and they denied that there was any difference between priest and layman. That is to say that there's no need for a Catholic clergy, and that the idea of a clergy is itself something of a hoax because there is no need for formal approval, that anyone can become a prophet and teach the Bible and Christianity. There were also mystics who were beginning to gain popularity, especially in Germany, and they effectively were tired of all the sacrament and ceremony, and what they wanted instead was a more inward-looking experience, a more spiritual experience, a more personal experience where you develop a personal relationship with God rather than having that relationship mediated by a bunch of clergymen. Another major figure during this period was Johann von Vessel. He was a learned priest, and he really flourished in the 1460s and 70s. One of the practices that he took exception to was indulgences, just like many of his contemporaries, and he actually had a formal debate with an inquisitor on this issue, and regardless of what each side had to say, ultimately the inquisitor had power and declared that von Vessel should be imprisoned. So he was, and he spent his last few years in poor health, living in isolation, and then died in 1481, with his teachings largely forgotten. Later on, Luther would discover that his arguments against indulgences had been much the same as von Vessel's, but again, we have to remember that most of the leaders of the church during this time thought that only the elite would respond to their ideas, and so they only wrote in Latin and did not disseminate these ideas to the people. So von Vessel, his ideas had no real chance of creating a larger spark because they were confined to a group of people, most of whom wanted to suppress such ideas and prevent them from catching on. Born in the early 1480s, Martin Luther came into the world as the men who prefigured him as critics of indulgences were leaving it. His father was prosperous, but also anti-clerical, as was not uncommon among some of the peasants of Germany. He thought that the church clergy were corrupt, and so he sort of inculcated in his son a sense that the church should behave in a certain way, that the church should refrain from luxury and corruption. Luther shocked his family when at the age of 22 in 1505 he decided to become a monk. He had a religious revelation, became intensely religious, and entered into an order of monks. So as not to offend his father too much, the order that he entered was known for being much more ascetic than most. Several years later, he settled in at Wittenberg, where he not only lived in a monastic cell, but also taught theology at the local university and managed to befriend the school's patron, Elector Frederick III, one of the most powerful men in the Holy Roman Empire. He lived fairly happily and quietly from 1512 or so to 1517, but during this time, he began to really, in many ways, adopt his father's view that the clergy were the problem, except that, unlike his father, Luther was a very learned theologian, and so he could better articulate the sentiment than his father ever could. By the time that the papal envoy, Eck, came through trying to raise money for St. Peter's through Indulgences, Luther was ready for the challenge. And not only was he ready for the challenge, but he had a very lengthy response to it at the ready. And this was something that he would post publicly and in many ways start the Protestant Reformation by posting a single document on a church door. On October 31st, 1517, Martin Luther walked to the Castle Church of Wittenberg and posted a copy of his disputation for clarification of the power of indulgences on the church door for all to see. The significance of the date is that it was one day before the majority of the town and surrounding area would gather in order to look at Elector Frederick's collection of holy relics. This meant that Luther knew that his writing would get quite an audience. This was actually a fairly standard practice, by the way, for professors in the German world to post their contentious claims at the church, since that was the major gathering point for the community, and this would enable people to learn about their ideas and to potentially challenge them. Professors were known for defending their claims. So, this was not at all out of keeping with what a professor of theology might be expected to do, except that Luther was directly taking on the Catholic Church. There was a papal envoy who was out, Eck, and he had been dispatched specifically by Pope Leo X. Of course, he would hear of this and react. I don't think that it would be fair to assume that Luther was completely unaware that his actions would have consequences. However, I do think that he certainly underestimated the firestorm that he was about to set in motion. Luther does not seem to have been fully aware of the pre-existing tensions and of the hunger that people had for an eloquent voice against indulgences and the other abuses of the church. Luther went on to debate Eck and other Catholics in his wake, and his fame spread throughout the Holy Roman Empire and beyond. A couple years later, the Pope tried to summon him to Rome, effectively to face trial, and Luther feared punishment. He thought at best he might be stashed away in a monastery near Rome, and at worst he might be executed. So instead, he effectively sought asylum from his protector, Elector Frederick, who granted it, and Frederick was then backed by Emperor Maximilian, who also defended Luther's right to remain in Germany and not answer the summons. Partly this was very much still a power struggle between the emperor and the pope, since Maximilian wanted to try to set a precedent for granting asylum and for not allowing the pope to summon whoever he wished. Luther at this time built quite a following and also began to write much more. There were periods where he would go into hiding effectively and not write because he wanted to let tensions cool, but by the early 1520s or so he was quite active in building his following and debating in public and producing writings by the bushel. Among the important men he recruited at Wittenberg were two of his more significant followers, Melanchthon and Karlstadt. From the 1520s until his death in 1546, Martin Luther would remain extremely active in the field of theology. He was effectively the head of what would become known as the Lutheran Church. Apparently, though, he saw himself much more as a thinker than as a leader, and much of the actual organization of the church owes more to his followers than it does to him. However, he was someone who would work dawn to dusk every day trying to deal with the issues of running a church and of establishing its theology. He had many ideas, especially in the early 1520s when he was still young and was really full of vigor. We'll talk about the ideas which ended up sticking, and I'll also mention one or so of the ideas that were ultimately rejected. Luther advocated for salvation by faith alone, which would become a staple of pretty much all the Protestant faiths. So that has been immensely influential in subsequent Christian thought. Luther also believed that the people should read the Bible for themselves. This was a trend that was already taking hold, but Luther really solidified that even more. And he also pushed for the translation of the Bible into vernacular languages. He himself oversaw the translation of an improved German version of the Bible. Later on, they would make even more accurate ones, but Luther's edition, when it came out in the 1520s, was a huge step forward. He also, at first, was against a formal clergy, but over time, after some disturbances broke out in Germany, he began to kind of go back on that a little bit, and ultimately the Lutheran Church would have its own hierarchy, even if it was never as fixed as that of the Catholic Church. He also was not a big fan of celibacy. Luther himself, we know from his writings and from the way that he lived his life after he left the monastery, was a man of pretty pronounced appetites, both sexually and in terms of food and drink and other things. And so he felt that these things were natural, that these were natural desires people had, and so he urged the members of the clergy in Germany to renounce their vows of chastity and get married. And a whole lot of people in Germany who had taken vows did exactly that. They left the church, the Catholic Church that is, and they entered into either secular life or they entered into the Lutheran Church. And in fact, Luther himself would get married to a former nun once he left his monastic vows behind. And today, in most Protestant faiths, actually all that I can think of right offhand, it's sort of the norm for religious leaders to be married. Luther also argued, and here's where he got his support from the princes, that secular rulers should not be impeded by sacred authority. So effectively, he advocated for the division of church and state, which of course is something that is still immensely influential in the world today. Of course, when Luther was arguing for it, it was largely to, secure the continuing support of his patrons. As we'll see, there were other Protestant leaders at this time who did not share this view. In terms of some of the ideas that Luther came up with, which ultimately did not stick, the one that I find the most interesting is that Luther, who at this point, it was still the early 1520s, so I don't think he'd ever had sex in his life, but he was clearly thinking about it a lot. He thought that one of the best ways to avoid divorce, which he saw as an unmitigated evil, was to potentially allow for bigamy in the case of sexless marriages. So if one partner was unable to perform, then perhaps the spouse who wanted to have sex could take on an additional spouse in order to fulfill the sexual part of the marriage. And in the example he used, Luther actually used the example of a man becoming impotent and then the wife taking on a second husband. So we can see that in certain parts of his thinking, especially in the early 1520s when he was liberated from his monastic vows and from being part of the church and all that, Luther for a little bit became fairly radical. Of course, most of that stuff never made it into the doctrine of the Lutheran Church and more or less died with Luther, but still you can see that this was an era of experimentation for Luther as he's setting out the theological guidelines for the Lutheran movement and many of the Protestant movements which drew heavily upon Luther as an inspiration. I think that it would be naive to assume that someone as intelligent as Martin Luther was completely unaware of the latent tensions in the world around him and of the political agendas of his contemporaries. At the same time, being as religious and self-absorbed as he was, he may well have underestimated just how much his ideas would be used as an undergirding for ideas and as an inspiration for causes with which he had no sympathy. Luther's teachings were adopted and utilized by a number of different people in the German world. There were fellow theologians, some of whom had been former colleagues or students. There were secular princes, and then there were the common people, and all of them would take Luther's teachings and make different uses of them. To start out with the peasants, some of them were beginning to encounter the New Testament for themselves for the first time. Before, they had only heard what their priest had told them, which typically wasn't all that much. Now they had access to German language copies of the New Testament, and they were either able to read it themselves or to attend public readings. And what they found is that Jesus was much more egalitarian than they had suspected, and so they felt like the society around them was cheating them of the kind of society that Jesus preached about. This led them to start to dream of a more egalitarian and possibly even socialistic society. There were others who took the idea that Luther had put forward, that this sort of personal spiritual experience is more important than sort of the institutional approval of something like the Catholic Church, and they took that as meaning that you could just eschew education as completely unnecessary, since really what you needed was faith, and that could be found within. So there were a lot of responses to Luther's ideas that he had not envisioned and certainly did not agree with. His idea of freedom was the freedom to worship, what he called Christian freedom. And so pretty much every major deviation from that takeaway of his teachings was something that he found to be embarrassing, and he denounced most of the teachings that came out of other people's mouths if he thought that those were not in line with what he wanted. And part of the reason why he was so quick to denounce others who had variant teachings is because he relied upon the protection and patronage of the lords of Germany, who for the most part were not in favor of, say, a peasant revolt or a redistribution of land or something like that. And so Luther was quick to denounce those who decided to take things in a different direction. One person in particular who defied Luther was a former student named Thomas Müntzer. He had followed Luther for a short period of time, and while they did have something of a personal falling out, Müntzer still considered himself to be a Lutheran in the broadest terms. He had gotten a few preaching gigs in Germany, and he had preached his own ideas. When the social unrest boiled over into a revolt that we'll talk about here in a minute, Müntzer viewed this as an apocalyptic event. He was much more into the idea of apocalyptic events than Luther. And so when the full-fledged revolt of peasants came, despite the fact that he himself was not really much of a peasant, he decided to place himself at its head in order to fulfill his religious duty as he saw it. Now, obviously, Luther denounced all of this because he thought that this was both a ridiculous reading of the Bible and also this was a cause with which he fundamentally disagreed. Müntzer, for his part, also was someone who believed that, in contradiction to many of the other Protestants, that spiritual experience, personal experience, overrode written testimony, i.e. the Bible. As we mentioned, much of Protestantism revolves around this idea that the text of the Bible is the only real religious authority. But Müntzer went more in the spiritual direction, where you could have these kind of personal experiences even if you had no knowledge of the Bible whatsoever. And he even went so far as to say the Bible itself is just a record of past spiritual experiences, but it is not the be-all and end-all of spirituality. So you can see here that Luther was more or less utilized by other people without them necessarily agreeing with everything that he said or really adhering to many of his principles in any kind of strict way. The Protestant movement from its outset was very much scattershot and took on a broad diversity. At the same time that the peasants of Germany were beginning to dream of a more just social order, the lords of Germany were beginning to dream of greater wealth and fancier castles, and in the event they would be able to act upon their dream a little bit quicker than the peasants. At this time there was a new emperor, Charles V, and in time he would prove to be a very enterprising, active, and successful ruler. However, he was a bit overmatched in the beginning of his reign, as he was a contemporary of Suleiman the Magnificent, the greatest of the Ottoman rulers, and a man who threatened Vienna, the capital of the Habsburg realm, more than once. For most of the 1520s, the lords of Germany would not have to worry about the emperor or the imperial army. It's also worth noting that Charles V was an ardent Catholic and a close ally of the Vatican. So you might think this would be a heavy deterrent, but because he was so busy fighting Suleiman over Hungary and later even just defending his Austrian homeland, this gave the lords of northern Germany a rather free hand in pursuing their own aims. The lords of Germany did manage to seize quite a bit of church land on the grounds that they were no longer part of the church. However, while this was going on, the peasants were also organizing. And peasants would cite both Luther's sermons and the New Testament, and they would use what they now knew as a basis to ask for concessions. They would ask for more rights from their rulers. However, predictably, the German lords had no interest in granting more rights to their peasants. And so, in order to force the issue, the peasants revolted. And this revolt occurred over much of central Germany, including also parts of South Germany. The revolt would rage from 1524 to 1525, and while not all of the major leaders of the Protestant movement would get involved, Luther, of course, was the most notable detractor of this movement. There were some big players who got involved. I mentioned Munzer earlier, who became one of the major leaders. Another leader who got himself involved was the Swiss reformist Ulrich Zwingli, who was effectively a kind of dictator in one of the Swedish cities at this time. Like most peasant revolts in the Middle Ages, however, this proved to be a bloody failure, and the peasant side lost over 100,000 people. They also did not get the full strength that they could have gotten because Luther's denunciation bore enough weight that it depressed turnout to take part in the revolution, or what would have been the revolution. Luther also, by doing this, drove a wedge between himself and the new German Reformed Church, and Zwingli and the Swiss. And this would create the kind of divisions, or would be the sort of first sign that the Protestant movement would always be fractured and would not really do a lot of cooperation in order to oppose Catholicism as a united front. It's also worth noting that Luther lost a lot of his popularity by opposing this peasants' revolt, but he did secure his place with the lords of Germany, who of course gave him his food and his shelter and all of that. Speaking of Charles V, by the 1540s he was at the peak of his power. He was well entrenched in his position as emperor, and he had accomplished more than most Holy Roman emperors in the past. He also was king of Spain. Pope Paul III began to fear Charles's power and influence. In the past, when secular rulers in the north had become extremely powerful and influential, they had very much dictated terms to the papacy, and that was not something that Pope Paul wanted to experience. And so at this time, under the guise of trying to keep Christendom intact, he gave Charles a massive sum of money in 1546 to crush the Protestant Germans in the north. And this was in spite of the fact that Protestant Germans had turned out for Charles's armies just a year or two before in a war against the French. And so Charles took the money and started the campaign. Charles was, after all, an ardent Catholic, as I mentioned earlier, and he was eager to stamp out the Protestant movement. However, he does not seem to have understood what Pope Paul was trying to accomplish, which was to weaken Charles and his realm. The Protestants were beaten pretty quickly. Many of the Protestant lords decided to pay a hefty fine and sit out the war. The Protestants were on the verge of defeat after 1 year into the war, and then Pope Paul, seeing that things were going a little too well, withdrew all the papal forces he'd sent north and all of his funding. And at this time he began to urge the French, recently defeated and looking for revenge, to intervene and help out the Protestants. It would be a while before the French would get involved. However, with the Pope's support withdrawn, the Protestants gained some heart and continued to fight on. To give them more support, the Pope even sparked a revolt in loyal Bavaria by accusing Charles of murdering his son. At this time, it was not unknown for popes to have sons, by the way. So the Pope was speaking of his own son. So the people of Bavaria, being loyal Catholics, wanted to avenge their Holy Father, and so they rose up to fight Charles. Charles had actually conducted a pretty solid campaign in 1552. Now, by this time he was suffering from gout, and his health was declining due to his age, but of course he's still a very experienced commander. So he had dismissed most of his troops to winter quarters and had retired. And that was when the French struck. They entered into Germany and combined with the Protestants, and they were able to start seizing territory without an imperial army to face them. Charles was thoroughly defeated by this and was forced to convene a quick diet where he effectively just declared that there would be freedom of worship in the Holy Roman Empire. The war between the Protestants and Catholics of the Holy Roman Empire would not officially end for another 3 years. In 1555, there was another Diet of Augsburg, and here the agreement to allow religious toleration was upheld. The resulting agreement was more of a 50-year ceasefire rather than a permanent settlement as events played out. At the time, however, it looked like it was an unadulterated victory for the Protestant cause. The Protestant Lords became much bolder after 1552, and many of them had come out in favor of Protestantism between 1552 and 55. At this time, they were so much in the ascendant, and so many of the electors' chairs were in the hands of Protestants, that they were able to actually foil Charles's succession plans. He thought that because he was granting this tolerance and ending the war, that out of gratitude they would agree to his son becoming the next Holy Roman Emperor and succeeding him as the ruler of the entire Habsburg realm. But instead, the electors decided to pull a fast one and opt for Charles's younger brother, Ferdinand. So, due to this, the empire that Charles V had ruled, which included Spain, the Netherlands, parts of the New World, and the Holy Roman Empire, would now be divided between his son and his brother. Ferdinand is pictured here, by the way. So, this peace would hold, not perfectly, but it would hold for about 50 years. And really, the worst moment in the wars of religion in Germany would come starting in 1618 at the start of the 30 Years' War. And during this conflict, there would be anywhere from 4.5 to 8 million deaths, along with a number of foreign interventions, and this would be easily the bloodiest of all of the wars of religion in Europe. It would be so bad that after that point, the idea of religious toleration became broadly accepted as the best solution for the problem. Up to that point, many of the more ardent believers were of the opinion that it was fine to allow for a little bit of bloodshed, but the horrors of the 30 Years' War were enough to convince people that perhaps toleration wasn't that bad. In the 500 plus years since Martin Luther nailed the 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg, Lutheranism has remained a primarily German religion. That's not to say that it hasn't spread beyond the borders of Germany, however. In Scandinavia in particular, Lutheranism has been immensely influential, and it quickly swept the region and has remained dominant ever since. King Christian III of Denmark, who came to the throne in 1534, had been a Protestant even before coming to power. As a young man, he was traveling around Germany, and he happened to hear one of Luther's sermons in 1521. He was immediately won over to Luther's way of thinking. Remember, among Luther's teachings was the idea that secular princes should not be impinged by religious authorities. As a king, or a future king in this case, Christian III thought, that sounds pretty cool to me. So after he came to power, and his rise to power was very much opposed by Catholic forces within his country, since it was well known what Christian intended to do, he eventually came to power, and one of his very first acts was to found the Church of Denmark. To this day, the Church of Denmark is still state-supported, by the way, despite the fact that most Danish people, or at least a very large percentage, are no longer religious. Norway and Iceland also have national churches which are offshoots of the Danish Church. Norway was a part of Denmark at the time that Christian III came to power, and Iceland, of course, was effectively a Danish colony for a very long time. Interestingly enough, despite the fact that the Faroe Islands are still a part of Denmark, in 2007 the Church of the Faroe Islands was recognized as independent. And this shows that there is a continuing evolution of Protestantism, as there is with Catholicism, Islam, and every other major religion in the world. In Sweden, right next door to Norway, King Gustav I, who came to power in 1523 and ruled until his death in 1560, also had a spat with the Pope over secular versus sacred power, and he was facing a bit of a revenue crisis. So he seized the tithes of the church after the Pope refused to confirm his preferred bishops. So this was yet another battle over both revenue and the ability to appoint bishops. So Gustav was not exactly close friends with the Pope by this point, and in 1536, seeing how the wind was blowing in Northern Europe, he just decided to declare the Church of Sweden independent. And it's a pretty bold move, but probably not as bold as the initial decision to seize tithes. But if you look at his picture on the right, you can see that this must be a bold man. Who else would have the courage to grow both an epic beard while also rocking the page boy haircut? Clearly, this is a man who has some moxie. Finally, we have the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Finland. And by the way, if you look up the official titles of most of the churches, they are called the Evangelical Lutheran Church of whatever country. This was established in 1809 when Finland attained independence from Sweden. So Sweden also had merged with Finland at one point, or had conquered it, and this was ended by Tsar Alexander I. So those are the major Lutheran churches of Scandinavia. It's also worth noting that there are two national Lutheran churches in Africa, one of which is in Ethiopia, and I cannot remember off the top of my head where the other one is. There's also a sizable Lutheran community in the United States due to the large number of German immigrants. If Scandinavia is any indication, then the motives of rulers who broke away from the Catholic Church could vary by quite a bit. On the one hand, you have Christian III of Denmark, who was himself a pretty fervent believer in Luther's teachings. On the other hand, you have Gustav I, who was seeking to enhance his power, and the best way to do that was to break with Rome. Henry VIII of England is yet a different cup of tea. Henry VIII was himself a happy Catholic. To his dying day, he very much believed in what the Catholic Church taught, for the most part, except when it happened to contradict his own needs. Henry VIII had fertility issues, and he had to go through 6 different wives in order to eventually sire an heir. This presented a problem because the Catholic Church had limits on how many marriages they would allow. This was a similar problem to that faced by Leo VI the Wise in the Byzantine Empire. Henry VIII, just like Leo, had to find a way to get around it, and the way that he did it was to simply break away from Rome and declare his church independent. So this was a fairly basic solution, but it was very much enabled by what was going on in the world around him, where you have Germany embroiled in a religious conflict, and you have the kings of Scandinavia also breaking away from the church. So in this way, Henry had much more cover than would otherwise have been the case. He passed his Church of England legislation through Parliament, and in 1534 it became the Independent Church of England. Now, as I mentioned, Henry VIII was personally just fine with everything that the Catholic Church had to teach. And so he made no real changes in the liturgy, but his son, Edward VI, who only ruled as a child, so really we're talking about Edward VI advisors, had much more interest in developing this church and creating some differences with the Roman Catholic Church. This, however, resulted in some serious backlash. There were two bloody revolts, one of them over a new prayer book which changed what people would say in church. And one of those revolts also was sort of pitched as being a full return of the Roman Catholic faith. Edward's heir or replacement was Mary Tudor, who was a Catholic, and she restored England's allegiance to Rome. However, when Henry's daughter Elizabeth I came to power in 1558, she quickly restored the Anglican Church and then created a more conciliatory settlement where things would be more fair to the Catholics. The Catholics still had to join the Anglican Church or they would be heavily, heavily fined, but she did allow for the ceremonies of the Anglican Church to very closely mirror those of the Catholic Church. And in fact, there are many today who hold that the closest thing to the Catholic Church is the Anglican Church. It's effectively the Catholic Church without the clergy. They have their own clergy, so it's not the Roman Catholic clergy. And under Elizabeth, we also see the beginning of the rise to prominence of Calvinists in England. Many Calvinists were able to acquire seats of power within the Anglican Church organization. This, of course, would heavily contribute to the character of the English Civil War in the 17th century, when you eventually ended up with a kind of John Calvin-esque figure in Cromwell, who was effectively the religious dictator of England for a number of years. But that, of course, takes us beyond 1600 and the scope of this lecture. Intellectually speaking, there were two major strands of Protestantism: Luther and the Swiss Reformed tradition. Although the Swiss Reformed tradition is often referred to as Calvinist, in fact the founder of it was a man named Ulrich Zwingli. Zwingli was a Swiss Catholic priest who operated in Zurich, and starting in the 1510s, he began to deviate from standard Catholic Mass. Rather than going through what normally took place at Mass, he instead did Bible readings, first going through the New Testament and then going through the Old Testament, making sure that his followers had heard the entirety of the Bible. He actually did not want to break away from the church. Like Luther, he was more or less proposing reforms, and then things kind of snowballed from there. To me, what Zwingli's life shows is that even without Luther, there still would have been a Protestant Reformation. It might have taken a different shape, but the forces there were such that there would have been leaders and there would have been movements. There were secular rulers looking for something to rally behind, and there were plenty of people who were discontent with the Catholic Church as it was. Zwingli ultimately called for changes such as changing the way that Mass was conducted. He himself, of course, had experimented with that without permission. And also he wanted to end the practice of infant baptisms. He wanted to do adult baptisms of people who willingly gave themselves over to religion. Zwingli, right after Luther had written the 95 Theses and debated Eck and all of that, turned away a papal envoy who was trying to raise money for St. Peter's, and Zwingli absolutely refused to let the man into Zurich. And rather than press the issue, Pope Leo X decided that it wasn't worth it. He had enough problems to deal with in the Holy Roman Empire with Luther, and it wasn't worth creating problems in Switzerland, so he basically let Zwingli get away with it. This, of course, increased Zwingli's influence in Zurich. And effectively, over time, the city council gave him more and more influence, and he kind of became almost a dictator at a certain point. By 1522, as Zwingli was trying to reform and set up a new order, some of his more ardent supporters wanted to take things further than he did, and they broke off to form the Anabaptist. The Anabaptists are a group we won't get into too much. Suffice to say for now that they never held quite as much influence as the I guess you could call them more mainstream Reformed or Lutheran groups. The most famous group of modern Anabaptists would be the Amish. However, there are other Anabaptists who are actually assimilated in modern society who work with modern technology, and an example of them are the Mennonites. So the Anabaptists haven't gone away, but they never have enjoyed the kind of prominence that the Calvinists or the Lutherans had. Zwingli went on to found the Reformed Church and seized political power, and this led to a war with the Anabaptists within Zurich itself. Zwingli was victorious, and then he decided to try to spread the power of his Reformed Church over the entirety of Switzerland, but at this point he encountered heavy Catholic backlash. He fought a battle against the Catholic cantons where he led about 1,500 men against several thousand, and ended up dying in battle in his late 40s. However, the Swiss Reformed Church was not done, and it would quickly find a new leader who was even more influential to its development. With the passing of Ulrich Zwingli in 1531, the center of action shifted from Zurich to Geneva. Here, a French theologian named John Calvin took center stage. Calvin was originally a French law student from Orléans who then decided to take up theology. Effectively, what he did was take up old strains of thought and take them to new conclusions. For the most part, he did not really claim to be an innovator. He claimed that he was trying to get back to what St. Augustine or even Paul had taught, and that he was trying to effectively restore those older understandings of the New Testament. One of his teachings is that God was revealed in the Bible, and that the Bible must be true because it is emotionally powerful. He also said that the Bible must be interpreted within itself, that you must find explanations for Bible passages by finding other passages in the Bible. It must be an internal hermeneutic, therefore. He also believed in predestination, and this is probably the best known doctrine of John Calvin, and the bedrock of the Reformed Church, at least theologically. Predestination is the idea that all events, including one's salvation or damnation, was determined prior to one's death. That effectively everything that happens according to a preordained plan. He admits that he finds this repulsive to reason, but just as with the Bible being true, it must be true because the idea of predestination has such an emotional impact. So, those were some of Calvin's chief teachings, and he took those teachings to Geneva alongside of a fellow theologian named Farel, where they presented their ideas to the city council and temporarily held great influence in the city. However, in 1538, the pair were expelled, and Calvin went to Strasbourg, where he had some connections and taught theology and preached there, until he was recalled to Geneva in 1541. After his departure in 1538, Geneva had experienced some social turmoil, and the Reformation in Switzerland was kind of taking a similar turn to what had happened in Germany, with people going their own way and sort of developing new strains of thought that were not exactly to the liking of the elite. When the leaders of Geneva looked at Calvin, they thought that they were getting a leader who could impose some kind of discipline on the city and who might instill better morality. That would be good for business. Rather than having a raucous city, it would be orderly, and people could get on with their business and commerce. The rich leaders of the city thought this would be best, because it would benefit them. What they did not anticipate is that Calvin had ambitions which went beyond merely being able to spread his teachings. After a brief period of leniency when he first took power, Calvin really began to tighten his grip on power in 1542, and would retain this same grip until his death in the 1560s. Calvin argued that the Bible was the source of law, and that only theologians such as himself could properly draw correct conclusions for how to apply the Bible. So, effectively, civic law enforcement became a function of Calvin's Reformed Church, and officials who were secular in nature became mere enforcers of the will of Calvin and other religious leaders. Calvin also made attendance at his sermons, which were held 3 to 4 times a week, mandatory. You could be fined for not attending, and the only way to get out of it was to claim illness and probably provide some kind of proof. He also was against the idea that was being promoted by Luther of sort of the freedom to choose one's own faith. He thought instead that people should be forced to join the Reformed faith, and therefore he began to impose penalties on people who continued to, say, advocate for Catholicism by having rosary beads or doing something of that nature. And while he did fine a number of activities, Calvin was known for harsher punishments than that, something we'll get to in a bit. Calvin also believed that class divisions were natural, and effectively he decided to reinforce those class divisions by calcifying society, by enforcing dress and activity limitations based upon class status. The higher class you were, the more things you could do. The lower class you were, the less things you could do, and this was now held up by the law, not just something that was effectively the case because of the lack of wealth. And Calvin most likely drew this from that passage in the letters of Paul where he says, "Slaves, obey your masters." So Calvin is not exactly a big fan of social mobility, which is interesting given that he came to power in what was effectively a merchant's republic, where social mobility is kind of at the heart of how people rise to that position in the first place. The most serious crime in Calvin's Geneva was heresy. Heresy against Calvin's church was seen as treason, and it was punishable by death. There were over 100 executions and banishments between 1542 and Calvin's death. So these were not ultra common. We have to keep in mind that Geneva had a population of only 20,000. So that's still a pretty high rate of people being executed for violations of Calvin's law. He also was not the kind of guy who enjoyed what we would think of as fun. Aside from an interest in bowling and very moderate drinking, Calvin was not willing to tolerate any sources of recreation or merriment. He banned gambling, playing cards, profanity, drunkenness, dancing, music, and plays. And when it came to music and plays, at first he allowed strictly Christian plays and music to be performed, then he decided even that was too risque. So in other words, what happened in Geneva is that the leadership of the city invited John Calvin in order to restore order, and instead they found themselves in his hands, and he emerged as a theocratic dictator. Another thing that Calvin did in Geneva was set up a school for missionaries where they would learn to be more learned than the missionaries of most other Protestant denominations. The missionaries Calvin dispatched to Europe would know Hebrew, Greek, and Latin, so they were easily able to hold their own against the Catholic missionaries. And this really created a kind of intellectual arms race that the Catholics would respond to by creating the Jesuits. At any rate, his acolytes would go out into Europe and recruit many people. We'll talk about 2 areas where the Calvinist message really resonated and changed the world. John Calvin trained and dispatched a large number of well-educated missionaries across the European world to create converts to his way of thinking. One of the areas where he had success, as we mentioned earlier, was in England, where many of the leaders of the new Anglican Church would follow the theological doctrines of John Calvin. However, his doctrines would have a more direct impact on the course of history in France and in the Netherlands during the 16th century itself. The converts to Reformed Christianity in France were known as the Huguenots, and at one point in the 1560s they were around 10% or so of the total population. That's a minority, but certainly a noticeable one. At this point, however, they began to attract the negative attention of Catholics who felt that the Huguenots were trying to take over and to threaten their way of life. And so this tension resulted in what became known as the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, where Catholics attacked the Huguenots and killed them by the thousands. After that point, attacks continued to occur, and they would continue to occur until 1598, when a former Huguenot became king, Henry IV. He was forced to convert to Catholicism in order to convince the Catholic majority to follow him, and he did well by his former Huguenot allies by declaring toleration. However, after he was assassinated by a fanatical Catholic in 1610 who thought that he was still a secret Huguenot, this edict would rarely be enforced very strictly. And so the persecution of Huguenots would continue, and their numbers would steadily dwindle. Under Louis XIV, who of course reigned for 72 years, and then his great-grandson Louis XV, who also had a very long reign, they actively persecuted the Huguenots and put pressure upon them to convert. In fact, Louis XIV had one policy that was known as dragooning, where he would station dragoons, mounted infantry, with Protestant families in order to put pressure on them and imply the threat of rape or murder if they don't comply. So this persecution was pretty steady, and by the time that the French Revolution occurred in 1789, there was a declaration that Protestants were equal to Catholics. However, by this point, there were so few Huguenots that there was no one around to celebrate this fact. And now let us move north to the Low Countries. The Low Countries, of course, being the Netherlands in the north, also known as Holland, and Belgium to the south. One Dutch theologian during the 1480s was also a big critic of indulgences. His name was Wessel Gansfert, but he lived and died in obscurity. The Netherlands were not exactly a hotbed of theological controversy at the time, and just like his colleagues in Germany, he wrote in Latin, and so his writings were not widely read or disseminated. Later on, however, when Calvinist missionaries visited the area, they found the Dutch especially receptive to the teachings of the Reformed Church. Part of this is because, as I mentioned earlier, the Low Countries were a part of the Habsburg Empire. That is to say that Charles V owned this area in addition to Spain and the Holy Roman Empire. When Charles died, he was succeeded by his equally ardent Catholic son, Philip II, and Philip became aware of the spread of non-Catholic doctrine in part of his realm, and so he began to heavily crack down on the Dutch. So effectively what happens is that the Dutch are both a distinctive ethnic group, and also they now have a distinctive religion, which makes them the target of Spanish oppression. So now for them, the Spanish are that much more foreign and unwanted. And to provide leadership for this movement, we have a man known as William the Silent, also called William the Taciturn or William of Orange. He was a Dutch nobleman who was originally in the service of Spain. He supposedly overheard plans for a massive massacre of Dutch Protestants, and this inspired him to become the leader of a national revolt. Over the course of many years, he was able to lead the Netherlands to independence, and this war between William and the Spanish was effectively both a bid for independence as a national group and also a religious war. So it's kind of where it's not clearly in either camp, it's kind of both. So it's both about ethnicity, or what we might call nationality, and about religion. William eventually achieved independence with the title Prince of Orange, and even to this day his descendants are still the ruling family of the Netherlands, or as it's sometimes called, Holland. Keep in mind, if we look at this map, the north is the Netherlands under William, and the south is the Spanish-held territory, which would later become the country of Belgium. Even today, the Netherlands is primarily Calvinist to the extent that it still has any religion at all, and the South is still predominantly Catholic to the extent that it's still religious at all. And that difference dates back to the time when the Habsburgs ruled the area and William the Silent led a Dutch Protestant revolution. So this has had an enduring impact. And there are also people, by the way, who say that even though the Netherlands has very much secularized in recent times, that culturally speaking, you still see a lot of Calvinist strains of thought in their thinking. The Netherlands also was the home to a large group of Puritans who sheltered the English Puritans and ultimately helped them get to the New World. So that's another way in which the spread of Reformed doctrine to the Netherlands was significant to the development of later history. I hope that all of this has been helpful in navigating the extreme complexities of the Reformation, which I realize is detail heavy and also extremely multifaceted. Hopefully from this point forward, this will help you to understand sort of the broad picture and have a general idea of what's going on and understand a little bit better why modern Europe looks the way that it does.